Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jess Lenore in Baltimore. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump gave a major foreign policy speech on Monday, in which he outlined his proposal for how to tackle the problem of international terrorism and defeat ISIS. This is a little bit of what he said.
They too have much at stake in the outcome in Syria and have had their own battles with Islamic terrorism just as bad as ours. They have a big, big problem in Russia with ISIS. My administration will aggressively pursue joint and coalition military operations to crush and destroy ISIS, international cooperation to cut off their funding, expanded intelligence sharing, and cyber warfare to disrupt and disable their propaganda and recruiting. Their recruiting is taking place right now, and they're setting records. It's got to be stopped.
This comes a day after the New York Times had a major expose linking Trump's campaign manager to $12 million in undisclosed cash payments from pro-Russian Ukrainian parties back from 2007 to 2012. Well, to discuss all of this, we're now joined by Robert Naiman. Robert is a foreign policy director of Just Foreign Policy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So along with outlining his policy and how to fight ISIS, he discussed a range of issues, including slamming the U.S. interventions in Iraq and Libya, both under President Bush and Obama. And he said, we should have kept Iraq's oil. Give us your thoughts. Give us your response.
Well, the U.S. interventions in Iraq and Libya can never be slammed enough, even if we have to endure Trump being the person who did the slammer. Recall that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was a blatant violation of international law, that the pretense of the invasion was weapons of mass destruction, which it turned out did not exist. And not only did they not exist, but the Bush administration refused to allow UN inspections of Iraq, which would have shown that they didn't exist or that there was no evidence that they existed. That the Bush administration wouldn't allow that to play out. The U.S. invasion of Libya in 2011 was a violation of U.S. laws, a violation of the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution because it's never authorized by Congress. It has destroyed the country of Libya and made it another breeding ground for terrorism and destabilized the region with the flow of weapons out of Libya's arsenals, arguably facilitated by the CIA. So these are terrible things that deserve to be denounced and for which the U.S. foreign, bipartisan U.S. foreign policy establishment is responsible. But there is tremendous incoherence in Trump's narrative. He says true reasonable things, and then the next sentence he says things that contradict them. So, for example, he says, we should cooperate with Russia. Well, that's reasonable. The U.S. is already cooperating with Russia. There is a split in Washington on how much the U.S. should cooperate with Russia, but there isn't any world in which the U.S. isn't going to cooperate with Russia at all. He says, we should be realist. We shouldn't do democracy, blah, blah, blah. Well, the democracy, blah, 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 is always pretty fraudulent. There's really been no time in U.S. history when the U.S. was actually promoting democracy. It's a story the U.S. likes to tell. Are we promoting democracy in Saudi Arabia? When did that happen? Are we promoting democracy in Bahrain? When did that happen? He says that, we should judge countries by their cooperation with us against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. If that's the standard, Iran should get a gold star. But he trashed it because, Iran is like the most anti-ISIS, most anti-Al-Qaeda country in the region.
Yeah, he also trashed the nuclear deal with Iran today.
He trashed it, which is exactly the opposite. If you think that the thing that we should really focus on is cooperate with anybody who hates ISIS and Al Qaeda to defeat ISIS and Al Qaeda, then you should love the Iran nuclear deal, because that was, that removed this other issue from the table of Iran's nuclear program to enable us to cooperate with Iran more. So, for example, the U.S. And Iran have cooperated much more in Iraq since the Iran nuclear deal. Or look at Yemen. It's widely understood that the Saudi intervention in Yemen, supported by the United States, against the Houthis and the former Yemeni government, has dramatically exacerbated the Al Qaeda problem in Yemen. Why did the U.S. Go along with that? Well, the Saudis asked, and at the time the intervention started, the U.S. was most concerned about the Iran nuclear deal and the possibility that Israel and Saudi Arabia would screw it up. And so the attitude in the Obama administration was, give the Israelis and the Saudis whatever they want, so long as they don't screw up the Iran nuclear deal. Oh, the Saudi Arabia wants to invade Yemen, fine, let's help them, let's keep the Saudis happy. So you see, this is a fundamental contradiction between the two things that Trump is saying.
And Robert, speaking of contradictions, Trump had, totally flip-flopped on his position on NATO, saying today that, he would work with NATO to defeat ISIS, and he had previously said that he wants to leave NATO.
Yeah, at this point, to use the word flip-flop to describe Trump is arguably an insult to the word flip-flop, because traditionally the word flip-flop describes someone who, had position A and now they have position B, as opposed to being kind of like a merry-go-round, roulette wheel of different incoherent statements. The part of the story with NATO is that there's an underlying thing that Trump is picking at, which is true, which is that NATO really is an organization that doesn't have that much reason to exist. It supposedly was created supposedly to protect Europe from the Soviet Union. After World War II, well, first of all, the Soviet Union no longer exists. Secondly, countries in NATO, like Germany and France, have grown tremendously since World War II. Presumably, they could defend themselves. How is NATO relevant? Well, it's relevant to doing things outside of Europe that aren't part of NATO's mandate, like invading Libya. So is that great? Well, first of all, invading Libya wasn't great. Secondly, it's not part of the mandate. Third, when it came down to it, Britain and France were the big boosters of the invasion of Libya, and the Obama administration, especially the Pentagon, was totally reluctant. They got the U.S. into it, and then the Brits and the French did hardly anything, and the U.S. had to do practically everything. It was President Obama's Republican Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, in 2008, who said, the American people aren't going to tolerate this forever, that the United States pays 80% of the budget of NATO, all these other countries in NATO that are doing relatively well, like France and Britain and Germany. France was Britain was cutting its military budget. People are not going to tolerate that the U.S. Bears such a disproportionate share of the burden for this organization.
And Robert,
which, by the way, isn't helping us that much anyway.
And Robert, I wanted to ask you, this speech comes shortly after the New York Times report on Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and his ties to the Ukrainian anti-corruption authorities, received over $12 million from unspecified purposes. Trump's been a lot of pressure in the last few days. People have said he's intentionally trying to sink his campaign. What do you think this speech represents? Do you think he's listening to some more rational voices in his ear telling him, he needs to backtrack on things like trying to leave NATO? or do you think this is just more of the same? In your final thoughts.
Well, again, he's tacked back and forth, and so I would be the last person to predict that he's going to stick to one policy. Clearly, the mainstream Republicans, for want of a better word, have some influence on him. What I would love, if he wants to challenge something, challenge the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, challenge the role of Saudi Arabia in promoting jihadism and the role of Saudi Arabia in Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and challenge the Obama administration's decision to continue arming Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen. That is something that could really improve the world if Trump would call that out. Rand Paul's called it out. Chris Murphy's called it out. McGovern, Ted Lieu. So that is a debate that we could really have. And maybe that arms deal could be stopped in Congress in the next 30 days.
All right. Well, Robert Naiman, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.